Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Molly Silberberg, and I organize BAM's Humanities Programming. Thank you all for joining us. Today's discussion takes as its starting point Yara El-Sherbini and Davina Drummond's public art installation, Arrivals and Departures, exploring specifically the power of naming in public sculptures and memorials as a personal and potentially radical act. The installation is being presented by BAM at the entrance to Brooklyn Borough Hall, where it will be until April 11th. I'll leave it to Yara and Davina to introduce the project more fully, and we'll share more information in the chat about ways in which anyone watching can participate by sharing names and stories. Thank you to Yara and Davina for helping us to hold space for this ever-relevant conversation. Thank you as well to Luba Cortés from Make the Road New York and Jonathan Ryan from RAICES, who you'll hear more about and from in just a second, for joining this discussion and for the work you and your organizations do every day. And thank you to Thomas Keenan for facilitating today's conversation. Within BAM, we've been thinking and talking a lot about the power of naming in light of last Tuesday's attack in Atlanta. Our thoughts are with those who grieve the 8 lives taken last week and all those who have been subject to ever-increasing anti-Asian hate and violence, so frequently fueled by xenophobia, white supremacy, and misogynistic racism. And while we have not yet shared, and I will not share here, the names of the victims out of respect to their families until they have given their full consent, we do wish to acknowledge and honor those individuals, as well as the many people within AAPI communities who have experienced hate and violence and who too often have gone unnamed with stories untold. We invite you to do the same. And we're thinking as well of the individuals and their families who are victims of last night's mass shooting in Colorado. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the land that I am on today and on which BAM's physical buildings are located, which is the unceded land of the Lenape people. I acknowledge Indigenous stewardship of this land and honor the Lenape elders, past and present, as well as future generations. A few logistical notes. Today's discussion features ASL interpretation and captioning. If you're looking for captioning during the live stream of today's discussion, it is accessible via the stream text link that's posted in the chat. And thank you to Antonio for interpreting this afternoon, and to Cindy for captioning, and to both of them for making today's program more accessible. We may have some time for questions at the end of today's discussion. If there are questions you'd like to ask, you can type them into the chat. Please note that BAM will not accept any hateful language in the chat, and BAM retains the right to determine what language is considered hateful and to delete comments or block users who do not follow those guidelines. I'm going to briefly introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Thomas Keenan, who will in turn bring us into today's conversation and introduce the rest of our guests. Thomas Keenan is professor of comparative literature at Bard College, where he teaches human rights, media studies, and literature, and directs the Human Rights Project, as well as Bard's BA program in human rights. He is also affiliated with the Center for Experimental Humanities and the Center for Curatorial Studies within the framework of the Open Society University Network. He serves as project co-leader for the Threatened Scholars Initiative, as well as the program in human rights and the arts. He is the author of Fables of Responsibility and serves on the boards of a number of human rights organizations and journals, including Forensic Architecture, the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, Scholars at Risk, the Journal of Human Rights and Humanity. And with that, I'll turn things over to Tom.
Thank you, Molly, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I have the enviable task of introducing Yara and Davina and our 2 visiting panelists, Jonathan and Luba, today, and then moderating a discussion. I hope it will be a really lively discussion, and I hope that all of those of you who are tuning in will send us questions in the chat, which we will try. We all made a commitment to be relatively economical in our presentation so that we can have as much time for back and forth. So Yara and Davina have made an incredible career of public artwork that also asks questions about what the public is and how it gets involved in artwork, and what happens to artwork when it's not the province of artists or simply of museums, but is in some sense public property. I think a lot of questions open up there that are really important, and particularly for this installation, which I would encourage everyone to get out of their pandemic-induced isolation and out onto the plaza to see arrivals and departures. And if you can't or don't want to, it is also on your computer and your phone. And you can contribute names and stories there. And I really encourage everyone to do that. So Yara and Davina are going to talk a little bit about the project, about the notion of arrivals and departures, about how this idea germinated. And then we're going to have a conversation with two representatives of maybe the I don't know how to describe them exactly, the best combination of direct service organizations and militant activists working in the space of immigrant defense and migrant rights in the New York City area. Luba Cortés, the Immigrant Defense Coordinator at Make the Road New York, which anyone who is in the world of human rights knows about. They focus on mitigating the damage that immigration and migration regimes inflict on communities in our area by offering support and also by speaking out. And I think both of those dimensions are equally important. We'll also hear from Jonathan Ryan at RAICES. Jonathan is the president of RAICES, which is the acronym for Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services. And Jonathan's team has also done spectacular work in this space. They're involved, they're not just expert commentators and human rights activists, they're involved in the project. And that's what we're gonna talk about today, is what happens when artists and activists get together to work on putting these issues in front of the public. So that's our topic. Yara and Davina, you are up first.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom, for your introduction. And I want to also take this opportunity to thank BAM for giving us this platform to have this dialogue, really, and also to present arrivals and departures. Now, before Yara and I start to unpack and explore this theme, this idea of the power of naming with the rest of the panel, we thought it'd be really useful just to really start at the beginning and talk about what arrivals and departures is, what form it takes, how it operates, and what the conceptual framework around the artwork is for us, and what we've found has been for other people as well. So if we really start at the beginning, for those who maybe haven't experienced the work firsthand, arrivals and departures takes the form of an arrivals and departures board, just like you'd see at a train station or at an airport. But instead of announcing vehicles like trains or planes, it announces names of people. It announces people who are arriving, so people who are being born, and people who are departing, people who are dying. And of course, within that, there's always space for announcing or celebrating people who are living. So anybody that's living would go up on the arrivals board. And what we're seeing and what we found is lots and lots of people do put past dates up as well, not just current ones, because they want to celebrate somebody who's living. So for us, it was really important that the boards were mechanical, that they were analog. So if you've experienced the work, you will see the quality, the texture of it is made up of these tiny little dots that are mechanical. So when a name goes up, you have this beautiful noise to really honor the name. And for us, that was really important, firstly, because we just like it. And we love the fact it pays homage to those old boards that many of us will remember from our childhoods. But also, we felt that the effort and the engineering and the time that goes into making a custom board like that would be another way for us gently to pay an honor to the person's name that goes up. So we've got the boards, but the boards are part of a triangle, really. If you think about a triangle, the work is almost like, you could talk about it as a contemporary triptych, and a term that art historians use to talk about a painting made up of three panels. It consists of the boards. It has an online element which is needed in order to activate the boards, the website. And then it also has an integrated public program, which we customize and really spend a lot of time on for each place that we show arrivals and departures, to make it as relevant to the location as possible. But also it's there to expand on the potential readings of the work and the themes of the work. So anything from looking at how we can live better to the politics of naming. And then I think if that's really talking about the basics of it, so maybe I will leave Yara. Do you want to talk more about the conceptual framework now?
So thank you, Davina, for that. So the public programme actually is what we're going to talk about further in depth, about the ways in which we can engage. But on a conceptual note for us, we're really keen on working with ideas that have very simple, accessible entry points. So as we said, it's a simple arrivals and departure boards, but it allows a wider public to engage with the work and to create multiple entry points, to think of really deeply personal issues around naming, or highly political ones. So our passion really is about the capability of work and how it can open up to a public and be responsive to how a public want to relate to it. So we see arrivals and departures as a public artwork. It's cited in the public realm, but its content too is generated by the public. It serves the public. It's a temporary memorial or a temporary site for celebration. But what it does when we give agency over to an audience is it asks us to think about the role of public monuments and memorials. Who are venerated? Who gets to choose? Who do public memorials serve, and who do they reflect?
And I think going back to what you said, Yara, a second ago about the work giving entry points to being kind of highly personal, but also at times highly political. And that's for us super exciting that the work can be both, and it's really down to the individual who's engaging with the work to choose how they want to go. But there's a few examples I can give just to kind of like make this real, because I think we can talk about personal and political, but what does that mean? So let's give some actual hard examples. So I'm going to start off with giving some more personal examples that are more about our personal emotional life, and then maybe Yara, you can mention a few more political ones. So there's been a few reoccurring ways that the boards have been used to bring up very personal issues, and not necessarily even to bring them up, but for the person who's engaging with the work to use it in some way that might be beneficial to that person. So one thing that has really surprised Yara and myself is the way that people have told their stories again and again about stillbirths and miscarriages. And we knew that was going to be something that would come up, but we had no idea that it would come up so much. And what we found is people have really used it as a platform to remember those pregnancy losses. And we're many of the pregnancy losses that have been shared are dating back 10, 20 years ago. And what's been really interesting is how it's come up, how it's brought up conversations about the naming of a pregnancy loss. So for example, some people have shared the names of their lost child for the first time in a public platform. They might have had it between themselves and their partner, but they've never actually shared it with their family, what name they'd given that lost child. One person put on both boards at exactly the same time. Actually, this happened on the first day we premiered the work in the UK. We were looking at the boards, and both boards started to make the noise simultaneously at the same time. And we looked up, and on both boards it said, "We never had the chance to give you a name." And you knew straight away what that meant, and they both had exactly the same dates. And then we checked, and there was a story that was specifically written directly to the child. So it wasn't a story in the third person, it was a mother writing to her lost child and using the site as a way to remember. So that was one thing that's come up again and again. We've also found that closure in a more general way has come up again and again. And we've just really been humbled by the fact that people have literally emailed us to tell us that they found that the work, by putting the person's name up and writing about them in the story, is literally giving them some form of closure. This is particularly relevant with lockdown, and the fact that a lot of people haven't been to actually say goodbye to their loved ones, and they haven't been to go to a funeral, for example. So they've used the boards as a way to say goodbye. And then, of course, this year we've had so many lockdown babies being announced on the boards, which has been an absolute joy to see one baby's name come up after another, and a story about the joy and the way that maybe that baby has given them hope and a sense of purpose through this really challenging year. And then to reflect on something that's more recent, that's, literally Yara and I received an email a few days ago from a fellow Brooklyner called Annie Basalto. She emailed us this beautiful email telling us about her experience that she'd had with her daughter, her 9-year-old daughter. And instead of trying to explain to you what that email said, I thought I'd just read you a few lines from that email, and then I'll hand over to Yara to maybe give a few political examples of how people have engaged with the work. So Annie said in the email, "Connecting my past to the present, simultaneously celebrating life and those who departed, absolutely filled our souls in ways we could never explain. Through every rolling letter and click, we were connected to them, all of them. Somehow, for one moment, we were multi-generationally together. It was emotional. We both cried. We were excited. Our overwhelming gratitude for life flooded us like a monsoon. Two drastically contrasting scenarios, celebrating life and honoring death at exactly the same moment." So I think that can just give you a sense of how some people might have experienced the work. And I'm not suggesting that we get lots of emails like this. This was a very special one, but it gives you a glimpse to a kind of way that some people might experience it. Okay, Yara, you go and talk more political.
And then moving over on to actually different ways, as we said about these different multiple entry points, the ways in which people have used the boards in ways we didn't know, but we hoped would be an open platform. We always try to create work that is open. So we've had a takeover where we had a racial justice activist who named massacre victims from Khartoum in Sudan from 2019. And we had 104 people's names go up, which is incredibly powerful durational takeover, incredibly political, really moving that this activist decided to use the boards in this way. A recent example is just this weekend, a member of the public submitted the name Young Grant, one of the Atlanta victims of last week's tragic attack, and wrote a story. So a member of the public decided to use the boards in this way. And for us, again, we're going to talk more deeply now because we're just about to hand over, but the essence of the talk, which is about the power of naming, which can, as we've said, we feel can be a very radical act. It's about naming those people who often aren't named, who are invisible, whose names aren't heard, whose stories aren't heard, and creating a platform for that. An example is, for example, when a natural disaster happens outside of what's defined as the West. In the press, we get, numbers. If the same or a similar disaster happens within the West, we get stories, names, pictures. How do we give value to those names? Who validates and values them? What is the value system around that? For us, we want to give space to people who are not normally named and give that over to the public to choose how to use the boards in more subversive ways, in more political ways. So alongside the political is a space for the personal. For us, ultimately, the boards are about visibility and creating and opening spaces for stories, names. It's about humanizing people by giving people that space to name. I'm going to hand the conversation back to Tom. We have lots more we can talk about, but we'll open it up and we can return to some of the subjects as we carry on today.
Thanks, Yara. Thanks, Davina. So Jonathan and Luba, maybe you could turn on your cameras and just very briefly introduce us to your organizations and tell us a little how you've taken advantage of the opportunity afforded by arrivals and departures.
Well, thank you. I think by agreement, I'll go first. My name is Jonathan Ryan. I'm the CEO and president of RAICES. I'm talking to you from San Antonio, Texas, and really want to thank BAM for the opportunity, and the co-panelists and the artists who are joining us for the space and forum to talk about this, I think, and have this critical conversation. Myself and at RAICES, we believe that law is downstream of culture, and that culture is downstream of art. And as activist lawyers, we seek to make narrative shifting changes in how our country speaks about and thinks about immigrants. And I personally approached that conversation with the belief that you cannot legislate your way to that kind of a shift. And that the laws that a country has are a product of the culture of that country, and that the culture in a country is shaped and potentially pushed by art. And so it's really by engaging in these conversations, I think, that we're able to speak to some of the last remaining open parts of the human mind, which entertains art discussions. So happy to be here and to talk about this. At RAICES, we're a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We came into existence officially in the mid to late 80s, around about the time that the Reagan administration passed the IRCA, also known as the amnesty laws. But our history predates that. It was a loose affiliation of volunteers and activists who formed something of a sanctuary movement in far South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, which is being spoken about so much right now, to provide immediate care and assistance of any type to individuals who had crossed the southern US border, mostly arriving from Central America at the time, fleeing the very bloody and dangerous civil wars that were raging at that time. In the 35 or so years since then, RAICES has developed more specifically into a legal services organization. We are comprised mostly of attorney and legal staff. Today, we're an organization of around 300 people. We have offices around the state of Texas. We provide, majority of our services are directed towards unaccompanied children and other children, that include separated children, who are in the care and custody of the US Health and Human Services. We provide services today on any given day to around 1,000 children who are in government custody. We also provide follow-on services to them after they leave custody and stay here in Texas. We continue to represent them and help refer children who leave Texas to legal services. But most of our work has grown around this. We also work with families who are in detention and adults who are both arriving to this country and who are apprehended upon arrival, and also those who have lived, some in cases of vast majority of their lives here in this country, and may for one reason or another be in the deportation process. We also have community services that are open doors when we are able to. Right now it's online, to provide all manner of legal advice and services to the communities where we work and live. And that brings us, I think, to this conversation. That general backdrop of providing immigration legal services has, I think, through our work, pushed us to not just be a legal services organization, but also a social service organization and an advocacy organization. And I think we could have a wide conversation about why, but I think the crux of it is that we work with people who are in many ways and all too often dislocated and dispossessed of any relationship with a government. And so when we are working with and organizing with individuals in that case, they are in a complete lack of a relationship with any government. And so you find yourself as an institution providing services, filling more and more gaps, and also pushed to speak and to be activist in how you speak. Because though we are practitioners of the law, we are working within a system that often referred to as broken immigration system, but we push back on that notion or that wording. We work within an immigration system that is a well-oiled machine. We work within an immigration system that does exactly what it was designed to do. And it was designed to deport immigrants. It was designed to separate families. It was designed to put people into detention. We cannot disassociate our own agency in creating this system as though it is a broken machine. This is doing what we want it to do. this brings us, I think, to the act at hand in this piece of art that I think touches upon critical themes for an organization like us and the immigration debate, which is one of arrivals and departures and naming. We, in our takeover and our plans, will be sharing the names and stories of individuals with whom we've served and with whom we've organized, whose own individual journeys, both physical journeys on this planet, but also their legal journey in their interaction with this country really represents this notion of arrival and departure. And I think the idea of the immigrant paints perhaps an overly initial simplistic picture of what the arrival and the departure is. You just have that airport image or Statue of Liberty image, or potentially the deportation image. But the truth obviously is so much more complicated. And people are, I think, when they arrive to this country, in a state of many forms of arrival and many forms of departure all at once. Many of the people with whom we work arrive to this country and are immediately placed in a process called expedited removal. And so they are effectively arriving into a state of departure to this country, physically and legally. They are still held. We often think, people we speak with, if I'm in a detention center in South Texas, and I'm speaking with someone, it could be a child from Central America, could be an adult from Somalia or another country, they're physically here in South Texas. I will leave that room, that consultation, and I will go back to my home, and I will stop off and get fast food on the way home. I will re-enter that normal space. But for the individuals with whom we are speaking inside of that same physical space, they're still, for all intents and purposes, have not left fully the place that they have fled, because they're captured and they are at the mercy of a government who in every way names them as and treats them as someone who should be leaving. And so physically, they have not left any of the peril, let's say, that they have fled, while I am, as their immigration attorney, let's say, representing them in an asylum hearing. And so that notion of arrival and departure remains. And I would say that in a way, the immigrant the process of arriving for an immigrant, and I speak as an immigrant myself as well, is one in which you haven't arrived until you are finished departing. And meanwhile, you never finish departing. And so it is a constant arrival, it is a constant departure, I think, to exist as an immigrant. And particularly myself as an Irish immigrant, where departure is almost a quintessential nature of the identity of Irish, is to depart and to arrive. And so to touch a little bit on the act of naming, I think too is very critical. And we are, naming individuals with whom we have worked, but this is itself a radical concept and one that is challenging. And our process is really consent driven, not conceptually driven in terms of participating here, because of, again, that state of departure that many people of us, those with whom we work and serve, are still so much in a peril of departure, that to share the name is to put oneself in a further vulnerable place, and may itself push one closer towards that departure, if not realistically, subjectively, if not objectively, in that space. And so it's with great care and concern and deliberation that we approach this, but also so crucially important. I would just finish by saying, in terms of naming, the immigrant journey is one definitely, and I was raised Catholic, I emphasize raised Catholic, so the idea of naming certainly harkens back to kind of the very oldest stories that we get told in school and when you attend church, in terms of naming and the power. And when an immigrant arrives to this country, particularly if an undocumented person or a refugee arrives to this country, a lot of times the only thing that they own is their name. And nevertheless, as they enter into this system, they are named by the system in multiple ways. They are given numbers, they are given status, and all of these status come with a name: respondent. If you are in detention, they call you a body. If they're in court, they call you a respondent. Naming occurs everywhere, and it describes the status and the plight of the person, oftentimes the persecution of the person by our own country. And I think it's interesting that that very last stage of immigration, at the naturalization, interesting term too, naturalization process, which is becoming a US citizen, is the one moment when literally the immigrant can, with their own hand, write into the application, this is what my name will be going forward. And so there is this kind of reversal as you go from arriving and departing to actually having arrived and become a US citizen. Finally, you are allowed to name yourself. So I think it's a very interesting kind of journey that's taken. So thank you so much for letting me participate in this. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan. Luba.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this space and really important conversation. So to take it about 20 years back, the story of Make the Road New York really begins. So it was two organizations, the Latin American Integration Center that was working around immigrant justice in Queens, and then Make the Road by Walking that was engaging young people and really focusing on ending the school to prison pipeline, and Bushwick came together to really create this beautiful and vibrant organization that is Make the Road New York. And so 20 years later, we have grown to have 24,000 members. We're a participatory led organization, which means that we really want the movement and the organizing to uplift the stories of community members, specifically Black and Brown community members. And so we focus on different core strategies to really move the work forward. The first is legal and survival services. So making sure that community members have access to attorneys, but also that they have access to applying for health enrollment, food stamps. We have food pantries. We have English classes that allow folks to have access to language justice and things like that that are really important, especially as people that are coming into the country and need this kind of support. And then we move towards policy innovation. So making sure that we're creating and pushing legislation to really mitigate the harm that has affected community members. There's a systematic marginalization, especially for Black and Brown communities, and this invisible labor that is not recognized, which ties into the power of naming, which I'll talk about moving forward. But we also understand that policy and, looking at politicians is not always the solution. So the core of our work is really community organizing, which is what I do. So one, making sure that community members really harness and acknowledge the power that they have. Oftentimes, as someone that was undocumented myself, we talk about coming out of the shadows and really embracing, saying, I am undocumented and I matter. And so we think that's really important. And when people, say, I am a worker, I am a sex worker, I am undocumented, I have been to jail, when they're able to name those things for themselves, it really takes away from the harm that has caused them. So when we engage in community organizing, we have a bunch of different layers of that work. So I do a lot of work around immigration and immigrant rights, specifically working with people that have been affected by DHS. So from beginning of being detained by ICE until they transition out of that system. But we also do workplace rights justice. So right now we have a huge campaign focus on funding excluded workers. As we all know, during this pandemic, undocumented people have received no relief, while they have been 99% of the essential workers that have been moving society forward. We also do housing and environmental justice, which is obviously at the macro level, something that's really important. And communities continue to be displaced in their own neighborhoods as a result of the pandemic and in general, as we know. And then we also work with young people. So making sure that young people have agency in their lives and that, they're not being sent to prison because they had a fight in school. So how do we look at young people with a restorative justice lens? That's kind of the work that Make the Road does. And again, we're really focused on community members. So we have weekly meetings where community members come and they build together and they eat food and they cook. Obviously, all of this is remote, but we've continued to engage community members even through this time remotely, which really says a lot about how community members see us and how they want to continue to engage in these conversations. And even currently, right now, there's a hunger strike happening in the city of Manhattan, where people are, trying to uplift, once again, the communities that are undocumented and need relief. So that's a little bit about the work that we do. And, I came to this organization as a young person that was looking for support for DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And I really found a community. That's what I found here, finding people and young people that were like, I'm undocumented. I also don't know what I'm going to do for college. And really feeling that love and support was really crucial. So yeah, I think to talk about the power of naming and why we want to engage in these conversations, I think similar to what Jonathan said, it's really important for us to bring visibility to all these voices. I work a lot with communities that have had their whole lives shaped by USCIS, by DHS. They're essentially being kidnapped. Even right now, there's supposed to be guidelines that immigration let out saying that certain people were not going to be detained. Yet I just organized the case of someone that thankfully was released that didn't fit those priorities. So one, it shows that there are failures in the part of ICE to actually enforce the things that they're saying. But also that these stories are not going to be heard unless there's people that are uplifting them, right? If we had not made this person's story visible, if we had not brought a name to the harm, if his family hadn't been willing to speak it on media, ICE would not have done anything to release them. But putting that pressure and naming that harm really shifted the narrative and allowed us to get a victory to get this person out. But unfortunately, every day there's people that have been in ICE custody for years and no one knows their names, no one knows their stories. And like Jonathan also mentioned, like these people are kind of stuck in this limbo where, they have arrived, but they haven't really arrived. And so I think it's really important to name that and again, to visibilize these stories. And so we're excited to do this collaboration. The stories that we're going to uplift are stories of people that we have worked with that have been deported to places that they might not recognize anymore because they came to this country when they were very young. And so are returning back to a place that is not their home. We're uplifting stories of people that might have committed a transgression, but the system did not allow for restorative justice. And so they were deported. And uplifting again stories of people that just were in the wrong place and were picked up in ICE raid and deported. So different stories, different things that occurred, but they all had the same end of deportation. And so it's really this regulation of movement that is so traumatic because as an individual and as a human, you want to have agency. And what DHS and ICE does is take away that agency from you. And so you don't have options of what you want to do, of where you can work, because your entire life is shaped by this system. So that's why we wanted to collaborate in this and why we want to uplift those stories, because I know I've already said it, but naming the harm feels really important. And it's our job as community to heal each other and to build each other. And I think that when we're able to uplift the stories, that's where we're really able to heal. So that's a little bit of why we're interested in this and what Make the Road does. And again, really excited to engage in this conversation.
Thank you, Luba. I'm thinking about Jonathan raised the specter of, let's call it like the different ways that naming can happen. And the notion that naming is not always an unalloyed good. There are names and naming practices that can do harm as well. And we're holding this conversation, in the shadow of yet more death and yet more cries to, as the phrase goes, say their names. And we started without saying their names for reasons, for intentionally and reflectively, for reasons that relate to what Jonathan talked about. And I wondered if we could start a conversation there about kind of differential effects of naming. It matters who names, it matters what names are uttered. It matters when people are saying their own names. But often the most important names to say are the ones of people who are deprived of the capacity to say their own names. So I wonder, maybe Yara and Davina, if you've encountered some of these complexities in the story you told about the child that didn't have a name or didn't yet have a name. There's a dimension of that as well. But maybe you could talk a little bit about encounters with this problem of different powers that naming has, and then Luba and Jonathan, maybe you could share some reflections on that.
Yes, I'll start with saying actually it's been really interesting because for us, every project that we do is about discovery and learning things. So as we were doing the project, we had to really think about ideas around consent. So we talked about the fact that there was a very intentional reason why we didn't name. We didn't put the Atlanta victims' names up because we don't have consent to do that, and who has the agency and power to do that. And I think what's been interesting is to see how when we hand that over to the public, that the public have been making those choices. We do also have a moderation system, which we don't need to go into, but we are moderating the names to make sure that there is no hate being presented through the boards, but we are actually creating the space for these dialogues. So one of the reasons why we wanted to work with RAICES and Make the Road NY is to talk about those facts that you're talking about, Thomas, at the fact that actually we don't have agency to name certain people, and actually all of the kinds of different names that people are given or go through. But I think for us, it's really actually about allowing the public to work with naming in completely different ways. And what's been so interesting is just the absolute breadth and depth. So Breonna Taylor, the work opened at BAM on the anniversary of Breonna Taylor's death, and lots of people have been putting her name up. So it was really interesting to see that members of the public were choosing to have the agency to do that. They felt they had the power to do that and they wanted to do that. We've had people put up, when the work was in London, were putting up George Floyd, but people also were using the boards to celebrate and put Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So people were using it to celebrate. But I think lots of times the public are choosing to take that role of taking the agency. I think when it's obviously very sensitive, like the Atlanta victims, and it's very current to think about the sensitivity around who, again, we're leaving that to the public to make those choices, but we have had to consider at every level who does get to name. And actually that's why we have stood back and not taken the position of naming people. We're allowing the public to create this work. But exactly why we want to work with these organizations, so they can really unpick that, so we can work with experts within the field who can bring into conversation these issues about the naming and handing that over to the experts, as opposed to us presuming that we can look at a deportation list and name 3 people. For us, that isn't authentic. It doesn't come from a place of truly understanding a person's position. So we often stand back and allow the public to make those choices.
Davina, you're muted.
I'm on mute, sorry. It's because my children are making lots of noise outside playing. I mean, I don't really have that much to add on Yara, if I want to give room to other people to talk, but I just want to say a couple of things. One was, what I found really interesting is actually when people name themselves, which hasn't happened very often. But when it has happened, it's always been combined with quite a long story about that person and the journey they've made in terms of their own well-being or their own journey, kind of acknowledging and accepting themselves, really. And that's a little bit offside, but I think there's something there about people actually acknowledging the importance of their own name. So even like in a conversation, when you say somebody's name to them, that has an impact on how the conversation goes. And that's just a very simple everyday way in terms of how we think about the power of naming, but it goes so much more broader than that. And then the moderation, like, how do we moderate names? And we try so hard not to moderate them, because we really just want the public to choose what names go up there. but every now and then an issue will come up, and that in itself could be a whole talk, but we won't talk about that now in too much detail. But it is a really interesting conversation. Like, how do we, if we have to moderate that, how do we do that mindfully and respectfully?
But I'll add one tiny thing. When I mentioned about one of the activists that we worked with previously who named the Sudanese victims, that we approached someone and invited them to think about how they wanted to use the boards, and we gave them the space to decide, them the space to name. It wasn't something that we felt we could do. It wasn't tied to my own personal experience, my own history. It was something that was deeply connected to this person. So in that way, we are looking for people to make those choices. We're looking to the public. We're not just looking, when I say we're working with experts in the takeover field, I mean, we're working with very specific groups, but we're actually saying to the public, think about these things, make these choices. Who is it that you would want to name and why? Because as we've said, we've had these deeply personal moments and these incredibly political moments looking at history and historical figures and socialists and abolitionists who are never named, who do not have a platform, who do not have a voice, who have not been written about in history. And people are using this moment to hope to enlighten people who are coming across the names and the stories.
Jonathan or Luba, you have thoughts on this?
I can go. So yeah, I think as both Yara and Davina have said, there's something around agency and consent of who is naming these stories and why people want to name them in the first place, right? I talked about healing, and I think it's really cathartic to be able to name something and to be able to heal through that. And I think in the work that I've done, when people say, like, again, I'm undocumented or I'm this, they're naming. And they're able to heal. And so I found that to be really crucial in the work that we do. And when we're talking about the victims of Atlanta, like, that was so distressing, and the way that the media was even talking about the victims was extremely harmful. So allowing that community to be able to name that harm, I think, could be really important and cathartic, and something that we all need to heal from. But in the cases, again, that we have worked, when we've uplifted the stories, we've really seen, especially with the loved ones that aren't in detention, to say, I've never had an opportunity to tell my story. Like, I don't know how to do it. And so being able to support someone through that process and them figuring out, this is how I want the world to view me. This is how I want the world to hear what happened to me, is so impactful. And people that have really witnessed such incredible trauma, that have escaped regimes, that have fled like so much violence, that want to talk about it and want to name that harm and say, like, this is me, and I'm not a victim, like, I'm a survivor, and it's okay that I crossed the border or that I am undocumented, because I am powerful and I'm beautiful. And I think that has been really powerful to see. And so I think it's all interconnected, again, with that agency, but allowing people to come to those conclusions, like you said, and to move with the space that they need. And I think that's what we can only do, especially myself as an organizer, is meet people where they're at and create those pathways for them to really come out and speak their truth.
I would just contribute. I think, this discussion around naming and naming oneself or being named, I think for me has a great parallel to also pictures and images. I think that, we could be speaking in terms of immigration or in terms of racial injustice in this country, and that when people or groups of people don't have names, or when they don't have an image or a picture associated, it becomes so much easier to commit violence against those people. We certainly saw at RAICES, obviously there was tremendous support that came about in a kind of a visceral response to the zero tolerance family separation policies under the Trump administration. And you could see, as the narrative shifted from one focused on individuals and human beings to a discussion of numbers and statistics and process, we could really see that support dissipate and the conversation dissipate. As things lose names, people really disassociate from them. And to take the naming just from a bit of a different angle, I think also the name of the president. I think it's remarkable to say, as a lawyer, there has been no immigration legislation since the late 90s of any real merit, of any real change. We have the same immigration laws that were in place before I went to law school, before 9/11. And nevertheless, how much has the way we have changed and applied immigration law changed? And when you apply that name of Bush, Obama, Trump, now Biden, to name the immigration laws, how dramatically this changes the perception, the discourse, how we are talking about it. Yet, as a practitioner, we see so little change. What is happening now on the ground is very much exactly what happened on the ground in the Trump administration. It is an enforcement regime. It's ironic that as I'm watching the television, the people are saying words of chaos and open border while literally putting images of motionless detention centers with the most still images of the border that I've ever seen, yet we're saying chaos. Naming these laws as Biden laws or Trump laws has completely changed the way that our country talks about it and it's perceived. I think it's critical to speak about that because the agency over these policies are actually with the people. And this ability to name the policies after the president or to name how we're treating people after one person, it is an ability to completely take the agency completely away from the people, either because they are terrified of that named person or because they hang their hopes on that named person. The effect is the same for the people, which is to completely renounce their agency over these policies. And so when we name the policies after a person, the people are disassociated from them. And really, we're the ones in control of these policies and responsible for all that's happening to the people who suffer under them.
Thank you, Jonathan. You anticipated a question that I wanted to ask about precisely the agency of the public, which feels to me that it's at play in both sides of this story, on the art side and the way in which the project is actually both addressing a public and empowering a public to take it over. And that also feels like it's a really important dimension of any kind of activist engagement, is first calling attention to things by making them public, but also trusting in the public that, to at least to a certain extent, that when it has the knowledge, it can act on it and take responsibility for what's done in its name. That seems like a meta story of that links both of these projects. But I wanted to ask, we amazingly only have a few minutes left. And I wanted to ask at a different level about this interaction between precisely an arts practice and a human rights practice or a civil rights practice. And I wondered, just in the simplest of ways, why activists want to be involved with artists. What's in it? You offered a few ideas at the beginning of your talk, Jonathan, and Luba alluded to it as well. But I'm interested in the way in which you're, in a sense, kind of claiming some relation to arts, or seeing a value that's not just aesthetic in the ordinary sense of interacting with artists. And for Yara and Davina, why would artists want to hang out with activists here? I'd say most artists are so jealous of their own autonomy and agency that handing it over to anybody else, let alone people with an agenda, to put something in quotation marks, might be complicated. So maybe in our last 5 minutes, we could just have a couple of thoughts from you all on that, on what's in it in this encounter.
Well, I know you asked Jonathan and Luba first, but since you spoke last about us, I'll just interject briefly and say, actually, Davina and our practice is socially and politically engaged. I mean, in other words, you know, a lot of artists would say they're socially and political activist artists, but we use that term about socially and politically engaged because all of our work is engaged with social and political issues, and be those mental health, emotional, love, geopolitics. So we've always tried to create work that has a platform for political engagement, because for Roz, that questions the role and function of art within society. For Roz, art has a potential to create change. It is a space for meaning making. It is about engaging the wider public into dialogues about how art can facilitate change. So for us, it's absolutely natural to always want to hand over some of our authority and autonomy to other people and work collaboratively and co-create things. So we're always keen to work with experts. We've worked with, for this project, with environmental activists, birth activists, death activists, and for us, we really wanted to work with immigrant rights organizations for the iteration in New York because it felt right for the context of New York, for the context of now, right now. This was an urgent debate. And for us, we've always thought about arrivals and departures as this other idea about literally immigration, about movement, about the movement of people in terms of deportation and arriving and his departure and an arrival somewhere else. So it has always had, as well as a philosophical, emotional entry point, this more political one. So to work with activists and advocates for us is just absolutely a natural part of the way we work, about opening up art to different avenues and different people, to a wider public, and working with as many experts as we can, and people and the public are experts in their own field. Everyone's an expert in whatever it is that they're doing, and bringing them in and working together. We don't have an ego, that kind of art ego. We actually want to work with people because I think it makes it more inclusive and accessible and relevant.
Great.
I won't add to that because I think Yara said, I'd literally made a few notes and then Yara ticked every single one of them. So I won't add to that. I'll give room to Jonathan and Luba.
Luba, you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I know we only have 3 minutes. I think from its most basic form for us, art has been really important in engaging young people, engaging members. I mean, when we've had massive protests, we have had community members work on building puppets, doing collages. A lot of the banners that you see make the road have in protests, have come from members who have helped do them. So that's really important to us, that community building and that art transcending language. But in the more working with artists, I think it's really important, one, to help elevate the stories. And I think working with artists can help do that. But I think also it's important for people to understand the connections that these institutions have had to harm. Which, a lot of people don't talk about that, how a lot of art institutions, people that I know, essential workers, aren't going to art institutions because they don't have the time, or they don't have the access, and how these institutions actually market themselves to make it accessible for Black and brown people to engage in them. So I think that is something that I do want to bring up, but it's important, right, to engage and be creative. And as we're working to dismantle these institutions, I think the more collaboration and the more voices at the table is important. And especially if voices that aren't often at the table are part, working with Davina and Yara in this installation, where you want to hear the input of community members, so it doesn't become this kind of silo thing and that is exclusive, right? Again, who is telling whose story, I think really changes the narrative and is really impactful. And so for me, it's all about community and accessibility. And yeah, I think amplifying voices through building, and not just with artists, but with other folks, so that we're able to, again, dismantle these systems. Yeah.
Amazing.
Knowing that we're closing, I would just say briefly, I as I described earlier, I think that it's so important to work with artists because, again, our brains are literally hardwired at this point to be resistant to the dialectic. For every argument I make as an attorney, there is a counter argument that people have already been seeded, have already been preloaded with. And so in a sense, literally the brain structure of our brains, I think art is the last place where we can engage in open dialogue. And I would also just say one big reason that I think we at RAICES and I myself engage in work with artists and public art is that is the realization at a certain point that the Department of Homeland Security and our nation's own immigration policies are themselves one of the largest works of public art that our country does. We talk about security theater. Immigration in the United States is governmental theater. It is a play, it is a function of the PR strategy of our government. And it is how the executive, the president, defines their relationship with the people. And it is the way that the president, it is the way that our national identity, kind of the way we speak about immigrants, it encapsulates the fears many times and projects the fears of our own government and our own people. After 9/11, it was terrorists. Now, as our country is led by a generation that is slowly dying, who is it that we are afraid of? Children. We are constantly projecting the fear of the Leviathan onto the immigrant, oftentimes the weakest and most vulnerable. Yet we're treating children as if they are bringing our nation into crisis, right? As if a great nation can be brought into crisis by children. But you have to name things in order to get people to think and to believe that kind of lie. And that's what immigration is. It is oftentimes a big lie perpetrated by our government. And we activists, we have to get engaged in that narrative. We have to challenge those lies, the way they're being told, where they are being told, if we are to be successful. And then that's engagement with art.
I think that is an amazing way to finish and an agenda for a future conversation, statecraft as aesthetic practice and the obligation of artists to meet the state in a way on its own artistic territory and start trying to challenge that monopoly. So Jonathan, Luba, Davina, Yara, thank you so much. I think this is going to be a resource for people to watch and listen to and think about for a while to come. So it's been great to have you. And everyone get out there and put some names on those boards. Molly?
I just want to end with thank you to all of you and thank you to everyone who is tuning in and watching us. You've given so much food for thought and just thank you all for the work that you do.
And thank you from us.
Thank you and bye all.